The air in the lawyer's office was thick with the scent of old paper and stale pipe tobacco, a smell Henry Miller would have hated. He'd been a man of diesel fumes, fresh-turned soil, and honest sweat. His two sons, Jacob and Thomas, sat on opposite sides of the polished mahogany desk, the space between them feeling wider than the 640 acres their father had just left them. The year was 1971, and the world was changing faster than a spring storm could roll across the Iowa plains. The lawyer, a man named Abernathy with a soft paunch and softer hands, cleared his throat. To my sons, Jacob and Thomas, I leave my farm, to be divided equally between them. 320 acres apiece, lock, stock, and barrel. May they work it with the same love I did. And may they remember that the only thing a man truly owns is the land under his feet and the character in his heart. Jacob felt a lump form in his throat. His father's words, simple and true, just like the man himself. He looked over at Thomas, expecting to see a shared moment of grief, of solemn responsibility. Instead, he saw a glint in his younger brother's eye. It wasn't greed, not exactly. It was something sharper, more restless. It was ambition. The division of the land was simple enough, a line drawn straight down the middle of the section. The equipment was trickier. The old man hadn't left much, but what he had was paid for and meticulously maintained. A 1951 Farmall M, its red paint faded to a dull orange, but its engine as reliable as the sunrise. A tired but tough John Deere A, and the pride of the farm, a 10-year-old John Deere 4020, bought with cash after 3 straight years of bumper crops in the 60s. There was an old Alice Chalmers pull-type combine and a collection of plows and planters that had seen more seasons than either of them. They split it up as best they could. Jacob took the 4020 and the older John Deere A. Thomas took the Farmall M and the bulk of the tillage equipment, arguing he'd need it more. Jacob didn't fight him. 3 months later, the dust of harvest settling and the autumn air turning crisp, Jacob was in the machine shed, tuning the carburetor on the 4020. He had the air cleaner housing off, the big diesel engine's intake gaping open. He worked by the feel of the wrench in his hand, the slight resistance of the adjustment screw, a language he'd learned at his father's knee. He heard a rumble from the lane, a sound deeper and more aggressive than any machine they'd ever had on the place. He wiped his greasy hands on a red rag and stepped out into the bright afternoon sun. Coming up the drive wasn't the familiar faded red of the Farmall. It was a monster. A brand-new International Harvester, 1466, its paint a gleaming, wet-looking red, the iconic black stripe decal sharp and bold along the hood. The tires were taller than he was, the cab a futuristic bubble of tinted glass. His brother Thomas was behind the wheel, a wide grin splitting his face, a new cap perched on his head. Thomas killed the engine, and the sudden silence was punctuated by the ticking of hot metal. He swung down from the cab, landing with the light step of a man who felt he was on top of the world. "What do you think, Jake?" Thomas beamed, slapping a massive rear tire. 145 horsepower at the PTO, turbocharged. Got a cab with air conditioning and a radio. No more eating dust for me. Jacob walked a slow circle around the machine. It smelled new, a chemical tang of fresh paint, rubber, and vinyl that was completely alien to him. The dealer's sticker was still in the corner of the cab window. Franklin County Implement. "She's a big one," Jacob said, his voice flat. "What did she set you back?" "That's the best part," Thomas said, his voice dropping conspiratorially. "Frank Peterson down at the bank set me all up. Said with land values going up like they are, it's foolish not to leverage your assets. I took out a loan against my 320. Got this, a new 715 combine, a 12-row planter, and a big V-ripper. We're gonna do things right, Jake. Get big or get out. That's what Frank says. Jacob's stomach tightened. He looked from the gleaming red tractor to his own 4020 sitting in the shed, its green paint scarred and faded, a testament to 10,000 hours of honest work. Dad always said never to finance iron, Jacob said quietly. He said the land is the only thing that matters. You don't risk the land for a machine that starts losing value the second you drive it off the lot. Thomas's smile faltered. He kicked at a clod of dirt. Dad's ways were for his time, Jake. This is the 70s. You can't get ahead turning 2 rows at a time with a tractor from the Korean War. I'll be done with planting before you're halfway through. I'll get harvest done in a week, while you're praying the rain holds off. This is an investment in efficiency. That steel ain't yours, Tom, Jacob said, his voice hardening as he echoed his father's words. It belongs to Frank Peterson. You're just renting it with the deed to your half of Dad's farm. That's not efficiency. That's a leash. The good humor vanished completely from Thomas's face. You're a dinosaur, Jake. You think like him. You act like him. You'll be right here on this same 320, wrestling with that old junk when you're 60. I'm building something. An empire. He climbed back into the cab of the 1466, the door sealing with a modern, insulated hiss. He fired up the big diesel, and it roared to life, a sound of raw, financed power that drowned out the quiet hum of the countryside. He gave Jacob a look that was a mixture of pity and defiance, then put the tractor in gear and rolled away, leaving Jacob standing in a cloud of dust and the lingering smell of a deal made with a banker. Jacob watched him go, the knot in his stomach tightening into a cold, hard stone. He turned and walked back into the machine shed, the familiar scent of old oil and grease a small comfort. He looked at the simple, rugged design of the 4020's engine. No turbocharger to fail, no complex electronics to short out. Just honest iron. He picked up his wrench and went back to work, his father's warning echoing in his mind like a church bell on a quiet Sunday morning. Owe no man anything. Now, before we go any further, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever had a piece of advice from your father or grandfather, a piece of old-time wisdom that the modern world told you was foolish or outdated? Maybe you ignored it at first, only to realize years later that the old man knew exactly what he was talking about. Let me know down in the comments, because that's the very crossroads these 2 brothers found themselves at, right here in the heart of America, with the fate of their family's land hanging in the balance. The spring of 1972 came wet and cold. The frost finally heaved its way out of the black Iowa soil late in April, and a frantic energy seized the county. It was a race to get the seed in the ground, a gamble against the next rain. This was where Thomas's new iron was supposed to prove its worth, and it did. Jacob would wake before dawn to the sound of his brother's 1466 already roaring in the distance. From the hill behind his house, he could see the powerful headlights of the big International cutting perfect, straight lines across the neighboring fields. Thomas's new 12-row planter was a marvel of modern engineering, folding and unfolding with a hiss of hydraulics, covering ground at a pace Jacob could only dream of. In 3 long days, Thomas had all 320 of his acres planted to corn. The neighbors drove by slowly, their heads turning. At the co-op in town, the talk over coffee was all about Tom Miller's new operation. "That boy's not afraid to spend money to make money," one old farmer would say, stirring his coffee. "Henry was a good man, but he was cautious," another would add. "Thomas, he's a go-getter. That's what it takes these days." Jacob, meanwhile, was fighting a different battle. His planter was an old John Deere 7000, a 6-row he'd bought used at an auction. It was a good machine, but it was showing its age. On his second day of planting, halfway through a long pass, he heard a high-pitched squeal from the 3rd-row unit, followed by a grinding crunch. He slammed the tractor to a halt, the sudden silence of the field pressing in on him. He jumped down from the 40-20, his heart sinking. The seed hopper on the 3rd row was tilted at an odd angle. He grabbed it and felt the sickening wobble. A main bearing in the drive mechanism had completely seized and disintegrated. Seed corn trickled out onto the damp earth. He was dead in the water. He spent the rest of the morning taking the unit apart, his hands covered in grease and graphite. The bearing race was chewed to pieces, the hardened steel balls reduced to metallic dust. The local Deere dealer didn't have one in stock. "Might be able to order it for you, Jake," the parts man said over the phone. "Take a week, maybe 10 days. A week. In planting season, a week was an eternity. Every day the seed wasn't in the ground was a potential loss of yield, a victory for the weeds. "Can't wait that long, Earl," Jacob said, his voice tight with frustration. There was only one other option. Henderson Salvage, 40 miles north, a graveyard of forgotten iron, where machines went to be picked apart and slowly rust back into the earth. The drive felt endless. When he arrived, Old Man Henderson pointed him toward the back lot with a stained thumb. "Planters are over by the creek," he grunted. "Watch for snakes." For 3 hours, Jacob climbed over and dug through the metal carcasses of a dozen different planters. Rust flaked off in his hands. Spiders scurried from their hidden homes. He found his prize on a wrecked and twisted planter frame, half swallowed by weeds. It was the same model, the same unit. He put a big crescent wrench on the main nut, braced his feet, and threw his entire weight into it. The nut groaned, fought him, and then, with a sharp crack, broke free. He worked for another hour under the hot sun, carefully disassembling the unit, his knuckles getting scraped and bloody. Finally, he held the used bearing assembly in his palm. It wasn't perfect. There was a little play in it, a whisper of wear, but it was solid. It would work. He paid Henderson $5 for it, the old man spitting a stream of tobacco juice as he pocketed the crumpled bill. By the time he got back to his field, the sun was low in the sky. As he was fitting the salvaged part into place, he saw Thomas's pickup truck slow down on the gravel road. His brother stopped, rolled down the window, and watched him for a moment. He didn't offer to help. He just gave a slow, pitying shake of his head and drove on. The gesture said more than words ever could. It said, "This is why you're failing. This is what you get for being stubborn." Jacob ignored him, focusing on the feel of the wrench, the precise torque on the bolts. His wife, Sarah, brought him sandwiches and a thermos of coffee for supper. She stood by the planter, her arms crossed, a worried line creasing her forehead. "I saw Thomas drive by," she said softly. "His fields are all done. They look like a picture." "I'll get it done, Sarah," Jacob said, not looking up from his work. "Maybe he's right, Jake," she ventured, her voice barely a whisper. "Look at you, covered in grease, fighting with this old thing for a $5 part. We're falling behind. Everyone in town says so." Jacob finally stopped. He stood up, wiping his hands on his rag, and held up the greasy, salvaged bearing. "This cost me $5 and a day's work," he said, his voice steady and firm. "That's it. It's paid for. Tom's first payment on that new red iron is more than our entire seed bill for the year. His payment is due whether it rains or not, whether the price of corn is high or low. We're not behind, Sarah. We're just on our own path. Dad's path." He saw the understanding in her eyes, a flicker of the same faith he clung to. She nodded, managed a small smile, and squeezed his arm. He finished the repair as darkness fell, working by the headlights of the 4020. He got the planter back in the ground and ran another 2 rounds before sheer exhaustion forced him to quit for the night. It had been a long, hard day, but as he walked toward the house, he felt a grim satisfaction. He had solved his own problem with his own 2 hands. He owed no one. He was still free. The years between 1973 and 1978 were like a golden dream for American farmers. The world was hungry, and the Midwest was its breadbasket. A massive grain deal with the Soviet Union sent commodity prices into the stratosphere. Corn that had been $2 a bushel was suddenly $3, then pushing $4. Land that had been $500 an acre was now $1,000, then $2,000. The bankers, once stern and cautious, were now smiling salesmen, handing out money like pamphlets at a county fair. The mantra was everywhere, from the coffee shop to the pages of Farm Journal. Plant fence row to fence row. Get big or get out. For Thomas Miller, these were the years his gamble paid off in spectacular fashion. The efficiency of his big, new equipment allowed him to farm more ground with less labor. The high prices meant his loan payments were manageable, almost an afterthought. He was a local hero, the poster child for modern, progressive agriculture. Frank Peterson, the banker, would point to Thomas's operation as a shining example. See what a little courage and a line of credit can do, he'd tell other, more hesitant farmers. In 1975, Thomas bought another 160 acres from a neighbor who was retiring. He didn't pay cash, he just extended his note at the bank. The next year, he traded the 1466, which was barely 4 years old, for a brand new International Harvester, 1586. This one was even bigger, with the futuristic control center. Cab that looked like something out of a spaceship. It was quiet, comfortable, and powerful. He bought a bigger disc, a bigger field cultivator. His farm was a showcase of gleaming red machinery. He and his wife took a vacation to Hawaii that winter, something unheard of for a farm family. At the co-op, Thomas held court. He'd lean back in his chair, a confident smile on his face, and talk about cash flow, depreciation, and tax advantages. "You got to use the bank's money," he'd proclaim. "It's a tool, just like a wrench. You can't be afraid of debt if you want to grow." The other farmers would nod along, mesmerized by his success. When Jacob came in for a bag of seed corn, the conversation would quiet down. They'd look at his muddy boots and his faded work coat, and their eyes would fill with a kind of gentle pity. Jacob was not failing. In fact, by any normal measure, he was doing well. The high commodity prices meant the crops from his 320 acres were bringing in more money than his father had ever dreamed of. But his philosophy hadn't changed. He saw the boom for what it was. A temporary blessing, a sunny day in a part of the world where the weather could turn in an instant. He didn't expand. He didn't buy new iron. Instead, he used the extra income to systematically kill his debt. He paid off the small remaining mortgage on their modest farmhouse. He paid off the loan on his wife's station wagon. He took the profits from one particularly good year, and instead of buying a new tractor, he built a proper, insulated machine shed to protect his equipment from the harsh Iowa winters. He paid the lumberyard and the concrete company in cash. He started a college fund for his 2 young children, a boy and a girl, making steady deposits into a passbook savings account at the very bank that was fueling his brother's meteoric rise. He was seen as a man with no vision, no ambition, a ghost of his father, stubbornly clinging to the past while the future was being built on the other side of the line fence. The contrast was never starker than at family gatherings. At Thanksgiving in 1977, the Miller clan gathered at their mother's house. The air was thick with the smell of turkey and the unspoken tension between her two sons. Thomas, dressed in a new pair of slacks and a crisp shirt, talked excitedly about the four-wheel drive Steiger tractor he was thinking of buying. "It's the next step, Jake," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "With four-wheel drive, I can get in the fields earlier, work ground when it's wetter. It'll pull a 12-bottom plough. Can you imagine?" Later, when an uncle asked Jacob what his plans were for the winter, he answered truthfully, "I'm planning on pulling the 4020 into the new shop, going to do an in-frame overhaul on the engine. Put in new sleeves, pistons and rings. She's getting a little tired, burning a bit of oil." The room went quiet. Thomas just shook his head, a smirk playing on his lips. Jacob's own son, 10-year-old Mark, looked up at him with confused eyes. "Dad," he whispered later when they were getting their coats, "why can't we have a new tractor? Like Uncle Thomas?" The question hit Jacob harder than any scorn from the men at the coffee shop. He knelt down, putting his hands on his son's shoulders. "Because our tractors are ours, Mark, all of it. The shed they sit in, the land they work on. It's all ours. There's a peace in that, son, a kind of freedom. You'll understand someday." But as he looked into his boy's disappointed face, he wasn't so sure. That night, unable to sleep, Jacob sat in the dark kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee. The radio on the counter was on low, tuned to a station out of Des Moines. A news report came on. A man with a deep voice, Federal Reserve Chairman G. William Miller, was talking about the economy. He used words like runaway inflation and tightening the money supply. He spoke of the need for fiscal discipline and mentioned, almost casually, the possibility of significant increases in interest rates to cool down the overheated economy. Jacob got up and walked to the kitchen window. He looked out across the dark fields toward his brother's farm. The big mercury vapor light on Thomas's pole shed cast a sterile white glow on the massive shapes parked below. The new 1586, the giant combine, the rows of implements, a fleet of red iron, gleaming under the artificial light, all of it bought with money, borrowed at 5 and 6%. What would happen, Jacob wondered, if that rate doubled or tripled? A cold dread, sharp and unwelcome, crept into his gut. He thought of his father, of a story the old man used to tell. "The banker," his father had said, his voice a low rumble as he worked on an engine, "is a fair-weather friend. He'll give you an umbrella when the sun is shining bright, and he'll demand it back the very second it starts to rain. Out on the horizon, a flicker of lightning silently illuminated a distant cloud bank. A storm was coming. He didn't know when or how bad it would be, but he could feel it in his bones, as surely as he could feel the solid foundation of the house beneath his feet. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a profound sense of gratitude for the stubborn, old-fashioned, debt-free ground he was standing on. The summer of 1979 arrived not with gentle rains, but with the hot, dry breath of a blast furnace. The sky, once a canvas of deep Iowa blue, bleached to a hazy, metallic white. Day after day, the sun beat down, baking the rich black soil into a cracked gray plate. The corn, which had sprung from the earth full of promise, began to suffer. The broad green leaves curled inward on themselves, a desperate attempt to conserve moisture, their color fading to a sickly yellow-green. On Jacob's farm, the rhythm of work became a slow, patient prayer for rain. He cultivated his rows with the old John Deere A, its two-cylinder engine popping a steady, unhurried rhythm. Pop, 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 that seemed to count the seconds of the long, dry days. He worked early in the morning and late in the evening, avoiding the brutal heat of midday. His fields looked stressed, but they were holding on. Years of careful stewardship, of returning organic matter to the soil, had given them a resilience that his neighbors, who farmed more aggressively, lacked. Across the fence, Thomas's operation was a different story. His fields, worked hard year after year with heavy tillage equipment, had less capacity to hold water. The corn was visibly suffering more, the stalks shorter, the leaves fired and brown at the bottom. But the real trouble started not in the field, but inside the massive engine of his International 1586. One sweltering afternoon in July, while pulling his enormous 24-foot disc, Thomas heard a high-pitched scream from under the hood, followed by a sudden, catastrophic loss of power. A thick plume of blue-black smoke billowed from the chrome exhaust stack before the engine choked, sputtered, and died. He sat in the climate-controlled cab, the sudden silence deafening. The air conditioner, no longer powered by the engine, began to blow hot, stale air. Sweat beaded on his forehead. He knew, with the sinking certainty of a man who pushes machines to their limit, that this was not a simple fix. The dealer mechanic, a young man with clean fingernails and a laptop in a briefcase, arrived the next day. He diagnosed the problem in under an hour. "Turbo's shot," he announced, wiping a smudge of grease from his hand with a pristine shop towel. "Looks like it threw a blade and sent shrapnel through the whole intake side. You're lucky it didn't grenade the entire engine. We'll have to pull the head, check the pistons and sleeves. It's going to be a big job." The final bill was staggering, $8,000. It was more than Jacob's father had paid for the 4020 brand new. Thomas had to go to the bank, to Frank Peterson, and extend his line of credit just to cover the repair. The tractor sat idle in his machine shed for 2 critical weeks, a gleaming red monument to modern fragility, while the weeds in his soybean fields grew thick and unchecked. That was the first crack. The second came at harvest. The drought had slashed yields across the county. Thomas, with his massive overhead, needed 150 bushel corn just to break even. He harvested 90. His brand-new combine, designed to thresh a river of grain, ran half-empty through the sparse, withered stalks. For the first time, the massive monthly payment to the bank wasn't just a line item on a ledger. It was a hungry beast that his meager harvest couldn't feed. The talk at the co-op began to change. The whispers of admiration for Tom Miller were replaced by murmurs of concern. They saw the strain on his face, the dark circles under his eyes. They saw the "for sale" sign go up on his wife's new car. One evening in late autumn, Jacob was in his shop, methodically grinding the valves for the 4020's engine overhaul he had planned 2 years prior. The cylinder head was on his workbench, the engine block on a stand. He was taking his time, ensuring every surface was perfect, every tolerance exact. He heard the door slide open and saw Thomas standing there, silhouetted against the fading light. "Working on that old relic again?" Thomas asked, his voice lacking its usual confident swagger. "She's earned a rebuild," Jacob replied, not looking up from his work. "Got to take care of what takes care of you." Thomas kicked at a loose bolt on the concrete floor. "That turbo job cost me $8,000, Jake. $8,000 for a 3-year-old tractor." He paused, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken words. "Frank Peterson. He wasn't so friendly when I asked for the money this time. He started talking about my debt-to-asset ratio." Jacob finally stopped his work. He wiped his hands and looked his brother square in the eye. "He gave you the umbrella when the sun was shining, Tom. You notice it starting to cloud up?" Thomas didn't answer. He just stared at the disassembled engine on the stand, at the simple, heavy-duty pistons and thick-walled cylinder sleeves. It was a design a man could understand, a machine a man could fix with his own 2 hands, and a set of wrenches. There was nothing simple about the inside of his 1586. It was a black box of tight tolerances and specialized tools, a machine that belonged more to the dealer and the bank than it did to him. "Dad was right, wasn't he?" Thomas said, his voice barely a whisper. "About the iron, about the land." "Dad was right about a lot of things," Jacob said quietly. "He didn't say, 'I told you so.' He didn't need to." The truth of it was hanging in the air between them, as heavy and unavoidable as the smell of diesel and steel. The clouds Jacob had warned his brother about didn't just gather. They merged into a monstrous, continent-spanning thunderhead. In Washington, the Federal Reserve, desperate to slay the dragon of inflation, cranked interest rates to levels not seen since the Civil War. The prime rate, the number that dictated everything, soared from single digits to a dizzying 21.5%. For farmers like Thomas, who operated on variable rate loans, it was a death sentence delivered by certified mail. His loan payments didn't just increase, they tripled. A note that was once a manageable $1,000 a month became an impossible $3,000. At the same time, a grain embargo against the Soviet Union, a political move made a world away, sent commodity prices plummeting. The perfect storm had made landfall. Thomas was being squeezed from both sides. His income was cut in half while his expenses bled him dry. Frank Peterson, the banker who had once clapped Thomas on the back and called him the future of farming, now refused to even take his calls. The letters from the bank lost their friendly tone, replaced by the cold, legalistic language of default and foreclosure. The leash Jacob had warned of years ago was now a choke chain, and the bank was pulling it tight. Jacob watched it all unfold with a heavy heart. He was surviving. It wasn't easy. The low prices hurt him, too. But his costs were a fraction of his brother's. His fuel bill was lower, his seed bill was smaller, and his biggest expense, interest, was zero. When he sold a load of corn, the check, however small, was his to keep. He used the money to buy groceries, to pay the light bill, to put a little more away in his children's college fund. He was living small, but he was living free. The breaking point for Thomas came on a cold, grey morning in March of 1982. A sheriff's deputy, a young man who looked deeply uncomfortable with his task, drove up the lane and tacked a notice to the front door of Thomas's house. It was a notice of public auction. The bank was foreclosing. Everything, the land, the house, the gleaming red machinery, was to be sold to the highest bidder. His empire was being dismantled. The news spread through the community like a prairie fire. It was a tragedy, but it was not unique. All across the heartland, the same scene was playing out. Good, hard-working families were losing land that had been in their names for 100 years, all because they had believed the gospel of get big or get out. The roadsides were dotted with the stark white auction bills, the tombstones of a generation's dreams. The day of the auction was brutal. A bitter wind whipped across the farmyard, rattling the bare branches of the oak trees. Neighbors and strangers gathered in grim-faced clumps, their hands shoved deep in their pockets, their breath pluming in the cold air. They walked through the lines of machinery, their boots crunching on the frozen gravel. The International 1586, the 715 combine, the massive tillage tools, they all sat silent and cold, looking less like symbols of power and more like extravagant mistakes. Thomas and his family were nowhere to be seen. They had moved in with his wife's parents in town, the shame too great to bear. Jacob was there, though. He stood at the back of the crowd, his face etched with a sorrow that was deeper than the winter cold. He wasn't there to gloat. He was there to bear witness and to do what had to be done. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man in a cowboy hat, started with the small items: tools, shop equipment, fuel barrels. Then he moved to the big iron. The prices were heartbreakingly low. The 1586, which Thomas had paid over $30,000 for, sold for $12. The combine, nearly new, went for a third of its original price. The market was flooded with used equipment from other farm failures. The bankers who had financed it all were now taking a bath on the collateral. Finally, the auctioneer turned to the main event. "All right, folks," he boomed, his voice amplified by a crackling speaker. "Now for what we're all here for. 320 acres, more or less, of prime Franklin County farmland. What'll you give me? Who'll start the bidding?" An uneasy silence fell over the crowd. This was different. This wasn't just iron. This was land. This was a man's birthright. Frank Peterson, the banker, stood near the front, a grim look on his face. He was there to make sure the land brought enough to cover his note. A few wealthy investors, smelling blood in the water, began to bid. The price climbed slowly, painfully. $500 an acre. $600. Jacob stepped forward. $700, he said, his voice clear and steady, cutting through the cold air. The crowd turned to look at him, the man in the faded coat, the man they had pitied for years. Frank Peterson's eyes narrowed. One of the investors countered. $750. $800, Jacob said immediately, without hesitation. He had spent the previous week at the bank, not with Peterson, but with a quiet loan officer in a back room. He had laid out his financials, his deed, free and clear, to his own 320 acres, the balance sheets from the last 10 years, showing modest but consistent profits, and the passbook savings accounts for his children, filled with the money he hadn't spent on new machinery. He wasn't asking for a massive operating loan. He was asking for a mortgage, a sensible one, to buy the land. The bank, now chastened by the crisis and desperate for solvent, low-risk customers, had approved it. The bidding continued. The investor, seeing Jacob's quiet determination, finally shook his head and stepped back. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, his gavel cracking like a rifle shot. "To Jacob Miller, for $850 an acre." A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. It wasn't an investor or the bank who had bought the land. It was family. Jacob hadn't bought the red iron. He let it all go, sold to strangers and scattered to the wind. He had bought back the dirt. He had bought back his brother's half of their father's legacy, reuniting the 640 acres that Henry Miller had loved. He walked to the clerk's table, his face a mask of grim resolve, and signed the papers that made the land whole again. That evening, Jacob drove into town. He found Thomas sitting in a borrowed pickup truck parked by the river, just staring at the grey, churning water. The bravado and ambition were gone, replaced by a hollow, broken emptiness. Jacob got out of his own truck and walked over, leaning against the fender. For a long time, neither man spoke. The only sound was the wind sighing through the cottonwoods along the bank. "I lost it all, Jake," Thomas finally said, his voice thick with shame. "Everything. Dad's land. I lost it." "No, you didn't," Jacob said softly. "I bought it. It's still Miller land." Thomas turned to him, his eyes filled with a confusing mix of anger, relief, and utter bewilderment. "You? How could you possibly?" "I did it Dad's way," Jacob said. "I saved. I stayed out of debt. I didn't have much, but what I had was mine. The money I didn't spend on interest payments, I put in the bank. The money I didn't spend on a new tractor, I saved." He looked at his younger brother, seeing not the rival, not the fool, but the boy he had grown up with, the boy he had thrown hay bales with under a hot summer sun. "It's too much for me to farm alone, Tom," Jacob said, the words carefully chosen. "I'm going to need help. A good man who knows that ground as well as I do. I'll pay you a fair wage. We'll work it together. We'll get through this." He wasn't offering charity. He was offering a chance at redemption, a way to work the same soil, to feel the sun on his back and the dirt under his fingernails, a way to come home. Tears welled in Thomas's eyes, the first he had allowed himself to shed. They streamed down his face, cutting clean paths through the grime of despair. He tried to speak, but only a choked sob came out. He just nodded, a slow, painful, grateful acknowledgement of a grace he knew he did not deserve. The two brothers stood by the river as the light faded from the sky, the chasm that had separated them for a decade finally beginning to close. The years that followed were lean, but they were good. The Miller farm, now a single entity of 640 acres, healed. Jacob and Thomas worked side by side, their partnership forged not in ambition, but in humility and shared purpose. Thomas, stripped of the burden of debt and the pressure to expand, rediscovered the simple love of farming he had lost. He brought his powerful work ethic, and Jacob brought his steady, cautious wisdom. They were a formidable team. The old John Deere 4020, its engine now running like a Swiss watch after Jacob's overhaul, became the lead tractor again. They bought a used, slightly larger John Deere planter at another foreclosure auction, paying cash. They fixed up the old Alice Chalmers combine and made it work for a few more seasons before carefully investing in a reliable, used replacement. They never borrowed a penny for equipment. The community's perspective shifted completely. The men at the co-op no longer looked at Jacob with pity. They looked at him with a deep, abiding respect. He was the one who had weathered the storm, the one who had listened to the old wisdom. His story, and his brothers', became a local legend, a cautionary tale told over coffee on cold winter mornings. They stopped talking about debt-to-asset ratios and started talking about sustainability, about stewardship, about the simple, profound truth of owning what you worked. Frank Peterson's bank was eventually bought out by a larger institution, his name fading into the history of the crisis he had helped fuel. One warm evening in the late 1980s, Jacob stood on the hill behind his house, the same spot where he had once watched his brother's new tractor with a knot of dread in his stomach. His son, Mark, now a tall teenager with his grandfather's square jaw, stood beside him. Below them, the entire 640-acre farm stretched out, a patchwork of dark, tilled soil and the bright green of emerging soybeans. The land was whole, healthy, and free. In the machine shed, Thomas was bent over a piece of equipment, a wrench in his hand, the setting sun glinting off his graying hair. He was content. His children were doing well in school. He had his family, his dignity, and his connection to the land back. It wasn't the empire he had dreamed of, but it was something far more real and enduring. "You see all that, Mark," Jacob said, his voice quiet. He put a hand on his son's shoulder. "Your Grandpa Henry left this to us, but a piece of paper in a lawyer's office doesn't make it yours. Not really." He pointed toward the machine shed. "That 4220 in there. We own it. This house. We own it. This land, all of it, under our feet. We own it. There's no banker who can take it away. That's the most important crop we raise here, son. Freedom." Mark looked out over the fields, then back at his father. He was old enough now to remember the hard times, the hushed, worried conversations, the stark white auction bills on the neighbors' fences. He remembered the look on his uncle's face, and he finally understood the lesson his father had tried to teach him all those years ago. It wasn't about having the newest or the biggest tractor. It was about the peace that comes from owing no man anything. The old man always said, Jacob continued, his voice soft with memory, that the land will take care of you, but only if you take care of it first. He said never to risk the soil for the sake of the steel. He picked up a handful of the rich, dark earth, letting it run through his calloused fingers. It was cool and smelled of life and rain. The steel rusts, son. The engines wear out. The fashions change. But this is forever. Don't you ever forget that. Mark nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He could hear the steady, familiar pop-pop of the old John Deere as his uncle started it up for a final chore before dark. It was the sound of survival, of resilience, of a legacy secured not with borrowed money, but with wisdom, patience, and 2 pairs of hands working together on land that was truly their own.